Great. Good morning. Let's get started. I hope you're having a good Friday. Hooray, we're at the end of week 4, just about a month into this thing, so we're moving right along. I'd imagine some of you are maybe a little bit worn out or just like relieved to be done with the group reflection assignments. For those of you that are not done, as a reminder, that's minus 5% for each day that the assignment is not turned in. Or if you would like, you can turn it in up to a week late with your get out of jail free card. So I am going to ask us to start out by going around the room and sharing. First of all, the group that you selected for this assignment. Second of all, the role in the self-perception inventory that you found to be the best fit for you. And then lastly, something that you learned about the group through this activity. For those of you that maybe haven't had the chance to finish this assignment yet, you could share what you have so far in regards to the group that you're a part of and what you've selected as part of this project so far. So why don't we go ahead and start today with the folks on Zoom. So Justin, why don't you start by sharing?
I selected my high school friend group. A role that I selected for myself was a specialist because I guess I bring some unique traits to the group, and then I guess I learned like some ways that we can improve like how we communicate is instead of just using text, we could also like FaceTime and stuff.
Sure. Sadie.
I chose my volleyball team here at Eastern, and I see myself as more of like a team worker. I don't really speak up a lot, but I do stuff, just not verbally. I learned how many different roles there are on our team, and that's it.
Okay, thank you. Hey, how about you?
I chose my work group that I was a part of. And then I put myself as an implementer because according to my boss, I was like one of the most reliable people there. And then I learned that my work was not as bad as communicating as I originally thought it was.
Millie?
So I chose my senior year FFA chapter officer team, and I chose for the Belvin self-perception inventory the plant, because I just felt like out of all of us, I was kind of the one that was more like the airy fairy child, kind of off in the distance. But I was also one of the most creative roles in the group officer-wise, so I just felt like that fit me. And something I learned was just going back and thinking over how we communicated, that we actually were very good at like listening to each other and being proactive with that. I just never noticed it in the moment.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. And Destiny.
So the group that I selected was also my work group. And then the role that I chose for myself was a completer finisher, just because I was always very anxious, I guess you could say, just making sure that we did everything right all the time. And I didn't realize it until I worked there that I was kind of detail oriented, because I was kind of in like the leadership role. So I think I felt like I had to. And then something I learned about my group is that we weren't terrible at communicating. And especially being younger, I think we did a good job at communicating the best that we knew how.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for sharing. So why don't we now hear from the folks that are here face to face, starting over here.
So I haven't finished mine yet, but I selected my wrestling team. And I would consider myself a team worker. I think that I'm perceptive, and I think that I get along with everybody pretty good. Kind of just follow my role as a freshman, I guess. Something I've learned is that, like someone said it, but there's many roles on the team, whether it be a team worker, a specialist, or seniority too.
Sure, sure. Age, seniority, and so on play a role. Yeah.
I also chose my wrestling team that I'm part of, and then the role that I find myself in is more of a team worker, helping like mitigate conflicts within the group, or help like or be tasked with specific duties to do on the team and stuff like that. And then something I learned about my group is the strengths and weaknesses and communication. And I got to like dive more into that stuff, which I thought was pretty interesting.
Yeah, thank you. Haley?
I chose the University of Oklahoma Student Government. I was part of that group. I chose I would be a team worker. I always kind of made sure everyone was like, participating and like everything was going smoothly, but I didn't take any like domineering roles in the group. I just kind of did what I was supposed to do and kept my head down.
Sure.
Continue.
Thank you. Yeah.
I choose my roommates, like we share in the house like 5 people, and we are something others. And my role is like team worker, kind of type of leader, or like specialist. Just listen to it.
Yeah. Challenge with cohabitation, but also a lot of ways to learn about your interactions.
I chose my chapter FFA officer team for my high school.
Uh-huh.
And the role that I was doing was a co-coordinator as the senior and the president of the team. And something that I learned about is like all of our perspectives and like different ideas really made us understand.
But I know that you have been out of reception for a bit, but as you're starting to think about this, what kind of groups?
Big shaper.
Yeah.
Or, like advanced community thing. I'm a pretty outgoing confident person, so. So it's a challenge, like the go on challenges and stuff, and
Sure.
so I try to take on most of the time when I have fun going on. So.
Yeah, seems like you have some good stuff to build on there, right? About your approach to dealing with challenges, tackling issues as a part of the group. So that'll help a lot in thinking through some of these ideas.
I chose my volleyball team, and the role was team worker. I'm kind of just there and let everyone like cooperate and that kind of stuff. Something I've learned is like how we best communicate. So like text messages, we don't really get a lot done through there. We all kind of just say our own stuff and
Sure.
nothing ever gets settled. So I just decided that like our best communication was through like in person and being together.
Sure. I've noticed a lot in things like group chats, right? It's a lot easier to get off task and off topic. Like people will like share memes or be silly. So it can be a challenge, right, to have meaningful communication.
So I chose my small group with the Marine Sports Network for broadcast here, and I'd say I'm more of a full member of a group. Because kind of started out being a producer, and we just build around 6 other people. I say the communication is absolutely not ideal for it because I can't hear him at all.
Sure.
So the way I have to communicate it is during the game is texting him, and usually he's never looking at his phone.
Yeah, that can be a challenge, right? If there's not a regular, easy way to contact a person and they're not checking on a regular basis.
For my group, I just chose like the Army
Uh-huh.
that I did, and I did the implementing. Sure. In my position, it's like jack of all trades, master of none. And one thing I learned is you probably use like nonverbal communication probably.
Yeah, that's a really good observation, right? The way that nonverbal communication plays into a lot of the cues or expectations.
The group I took was my high school basketball team. My role was the co-coordinator for like 2-3 years there. One thing I learned about the group was that we communicate a lot better than I thought we did.
Sure.
Through everything else, we actually did a lot of communication over time.
Sure.
The group I chose was my family. The role that I played was a team worker and I just what
Thanks for sharing. So I wanted to have us go around and share because first of all, I know that you all put a lot of work into developing this, and I wanted you to share some of the things you learned through that process. There were a couple of things that immediately stood out to me, things we can think about as we continue on some of these assignments and ideas in class. One of them being, right, that communication in groups is oftentimes a lot more complex than we think about at first, right? Looks like Andrew brought up the role that nonverbal communication plays is a really big part, but also the way that things such as roles, seniority, and so on play into it. There's a lot of different roles people occupy within a group. We don't always think about it, right? We don't think about how a group comes together and works. It oftentimes just does. But a lot of the skills that we develop in the class help us to understand the what, right? Secondarily, I really like the way that you all brought up some situations where communication works better than you might think in a group, but also contexts in which there's ways that communication could improve, particularly the way that things like text or phone or non-face-to-face messaging might work, some of the ways to optimize our communication in groups and so on, right? And again, as folks brought up, the idea that in a lot of these groups, people are bringing in very different and specific levels of experience too. So it seems like there was a lot of opportunity to reflect and think about how these groups kind of work together and some of the ways even that for groups we're part of that we can make our communication more effective and efficient. So that's really good to hear and hopefully is useful for you as you think about the groups that you're part of in the future and the way that you organize and interact with those groups. So because of a lot of the delays, because of snow days and so on, there is going to be another assignment coming up that's asking you to reflect on some of the groups that you've been participating in class for some small group activities. That was originally listed as due at the end of next week, but obviously that is not a reasonable window for you. So I am going to push that back to week 6, but I am later today going to post and provide you some information regarding that upcoming assignment, and then also talk about it in more detail on Monday, right? So you'll have over 2 weeks from when I post the assignment to work on and to develop and to think about that assignment, but just to know, not to be alarmed that that's not coming up soon because again, of the delays and all of that. And I want to take the time to give you a breather after finishing this assignment and to help you in receiving feedback and incorporating feedback from me that can help for your next assignment. So look for grades and feedback from me on these assignments, some general feedback on this assignment in class next week. And we'll be talking more about some of the things coming up in the class. So last class, right, we were developing our understanding of intercultural and international communication a little bit. We were talking last class about the way that we can use culture in different groups, different types of roles. Again, the idea of passing the torch, right, or communication happening between generations. We also talked about the idea of uncertainty reduction theory, right, or URT. You can think about it again as stranger danger and the main ways that we manage and mitigate risk as we participate in groups. And also some of the ways that culture can be measured and evaluated differently. Things such as time orientation, ways that we approach materialism, right, or money. We did a little activity that was asking you to think about how joining a new group, like a hiking group, could be impacted by some of these different measurements of culture too. As we brought up, right, culture when you become a new member can be a really big component. Becoming hazed or having the sort of ritual or rite that makes you a member of the group. Some of the patterns of behavior that group members do, and oftentimes the motivation that more senior members of the group have to pass the torch, right? So if you're a first-year student and you're joining an athletic team, oftentimes the more senior members are excited to have you aboard because you're the future of the group. We also, again, talked about uncertainty reduction theory. This is a useful framework to think about how we communicate with others, particularly the idea that, again, we're seeking out information that helps us to deal with the uncertainty we feel with other people, especially when we're in a small group and we have a lot of new members, right? We're trying to figure out who everybody is, if they're trustworthy, how we can work together with them. And we might find some ways to welcome or use communication to figure out that information. And then we talked about some of the measures of cultural difference. Again, Not to suggest the cultures are better or worse, but that the ways that cultures understand each other and to communicate with each other differs on a lot of these axes, right? In power distance, for instance, low power distance means that you're often openly disagreeing with superiors. So you have a supervisor and you're openly debating or discussing with them. Whereas high power distance oftentimes means there's more deferring to authority and accepting authority without question. So again, those can impact the ways that we behave in small groups. So for this class, I want to talk a little bit about structure, including the role of international communication and the ways that group communication behavior is able to happen in these international and applied ways. We'll also be talking about theories X, Y, and Z to help us to understand basically the ways that we theorize and think about how small groups communicate. So one of the first starting points then is to think about a system, right? And a system as a more organized and structured way that groups behave, right? So one example that I would point to is Lebanon. Lebanon is a country in which the organization of its government, right, including its primary representatives that are in charge of major policy issues, there are members that are each represented on the basis of the different religious and spiritual views and populations that are offered within the country. That is, the country of Lebanon, right? Governmental organization and structure is determined by and representative of the differences in religious or spiritual views, right? That's one example of a system, right, or a way that organizations are structured at this broader level, right? We can also think about countries such as Australia, right, where its prime minister and leadership is actually determined by the lower chamber. In countries like the United States, right, we have what is oftentimes very different from other countries in a winner-take-all system, right, where the president or members of Congress, right, are elected by the plurality, right, or the candidate that receives the most votes. In a lot of other countries, including the sort of British system, right, there is proportional representation, right, or PR systems in a lot of European countries in which the leadership or political representation is determined based on the percentage or share of votes that different groups receive. That's why different groups like the Pirate Party, right, will show up as actually occupying seats in legislature. So I bring up those examples to explain some of the ways that the differences in organization at an international level, right, organization of different countries, governments, and so on, is oftentimes a reflection of the cultural values and beliefs that members of the group have, right? Think about the United States, a lot of the way that its organization structure was set up, right, by things such as the Constitution, right, a lot of focus on founding fathers, and so on, right? In countries such as Lebanon, again, there might be unique levels of political and social tension or challenges, and as a result, right, there might be a need for government to reflect some of the populations religiously and culturally that differ, given some of the tensions that might otherwise be felt if populations weren't represented, right? So systems help to guide, direct, promote, restrain, and so on, the behaviors that members of that population do, right? If you're a member of an international group or organization and you have the ability to vote or to represent your people, that is going to impact who's at the table and how those populations reach conclusions on issues. This, right, really ties to this core idea of international communication, right? International communication can be, and often is, intercultural, right? International communication is very specifically focused on how different nations communicate. So this could be, for instance, diplomats, right, or people who occupy levels of political or social leadership. But it can also be some of the ways that individuals or members of different groups communicate with each other too. If, for instance, you've ever traveled or studied abroad, right, that would be an example of international communication and adapting to the culture. If you are like an international student who is visiting or moving here, right, that is also an example of how international communication might shape your interactions. So, right, one example of this, I'm curious how many folks have followed some of the developments happening right now in Eastern Europe and Russia. People have been paying attention or following a bit of the news? Yes, Andrew and Clint, yeah. So, right, there are some escalating tensions right now surrounding concerns, right, of Russian expansion and invasion into Ukraine, right? And one of the things that we've seen as a result of these ongoing political tensions, right, has been substantial international communication. Recently, the United States, through the Pentagon, right, put out a statement essentially condemning Putin and Russia's behavior. There's also, right, Russia kind of responding to and addressing this expansion, right? And a lot of the way that this is being communicated is an example of international communication intentions. The United States obviously has concerns about regional alliances, including in areas related to Eastern Europe and European Union. And, right, Russia has a lot of history with Ukraine in the area and with sort of the role and power that might come with that physical space, right? So there was a lot of tension and disagreement that's happening, and understanding the context and history surrounding the relationship between these two countries is crucial to understanding how this international communication is happening, right? You can't read or understand this tension without understanding, for instance, the history of the Cold War, right? Or the history of the New START Treaty that was designed to reduce nuclear proliferation, or more recent tensions that have been happening in the area, right? In this way, the values, the beliefs, what is important to members of different countries or groups really shape some of the ways that internationally people communicate differently, right? That where you physically occupy and come from, the customs and beliefs that are important to you are going to be a source of potential disagreement, of challenge, of tension. To give a, again, more lighthearted example, right? If you were traveling to another country, again, if you were used to tipping when you go out to a restaurant, right? You move to a country where tipping is no longer a thing, and you're adjusting to and dealing with those differences and sort of catching yourself saying, oh wait, I'm not supposed to do that. So if you've taken something like a civics or political science or social studies class, right, which I imagine is most of you, then you're probably familiar with some of the differences in governmental organization and structure. But I do think that some of these things to know are useful when we think about how they impact the way that group members communicate, right? Obviously, under a more democratic system, right, there's this focus on individuals being occupying a role of decision-making and power, right? A more pure direct democracy would be the idea that a majority decision would ultimately decide something. A representative democracy or a republic would be more focused on electing representatives, like we do in the United States, that would serve and represent the interests of their populations. So under that more democratic form, right, that has some close relationships to power distance, there might be a leader or facilitator within a small group, but maybe your group overall votes democratically on what to do, right? If you're trying to decide something like your team's travel schedule, or you're trying to work together to create a work schedule, maybe that's something that everybody has input on versus a more top-down approach. A centralized rule, right, concentrates power into one particular area. Again, an example, something like a military dictatorship would be that in action. But you could also think about this in terms of groups in which a leader or supervisor would be the person, or coach, right, is the person that has the power to make the calls and to make major decisions. Anarchy, right, would be a lack of centralized government, right, under a system in which there's a lot of different forms or ways of defining anarchy, right, but an organizational structure in which the lack of formal guidelines and practices would impact the way that your members work. You might see more anarchic system in a lot of your friend groups, right, where there's not like a leader of the group, but that people are sort of shifting in roles over time. Another key idea here, right, is some of the differences between civil and common law. Civil law referring to the hard-coded rules that are spelled out in detail. So if you think about something like the Bill of Rights in the United States, that would fit under civil law. It's written, it's clear, it's referred to. But, right, there's a lot of variation in the idea of common law. I'm curious, how folks feel. People are familiar with this. Does the United States have a written, hard-coded right to privacy? Right. So the right to privacy is not in the Bill of Rights. It's not an enumerated or written right. But in a lot of landmark and major cases, including Supreme Court cases, right, the right to privacy has been given through common law, right? It's been given as a thing that people should have access to, not because it's hard-coded and written in the Constitution, but because it's given as something over time through judge precedent interpreting law and so on, right? Again, this is not a political science or social studies course, but I do think it's helpful for us to think about how some of the ways that governments and organizations structure themselves then impacts the way they communicate. So another thing to think about here is the role of markets, right? And the way that markets can impact our communication. How many folks have heard of this whole thing surrounding Martin Shkreli? Does this name ring a bell for anybody? So this was a kind of major concern because this was a person that was the former founder of Terns Pharma, who is famous or perhaps infamous for massively skyrocketing the price of insulin in the United States. He was recently hit, and I think they found him guilty and was owing like a $3 million or $1 billion lawsuit. So anyway, he was focused on things like price gouging, right? Of pharmaceutical drug prices in the United States skyrocketing and causing a major rift and problems for things like access to insulin, right? Because if you're diabetic, insulin is crucial. You need to regularly have it in order to survive. There's been a lot of cases in the United States where, as a result of not being able to afford it, right, or healthcare, people have had to ration insulin and have died because they haven't been able to get the amount that they need. So that can be an example, right, of the way that markets are not working effectively. There's a lot of challenges with markets in the United States and their ability, particularly in areas like healthcare, right, to meet the concerns and needs of populations. It's kind of widely condemned as a practice in costs of goods and services. Another example, right, over here in the photo, nighttime, right, of North and South Korea. You might know, right, North and South Korea, time of the Civil War, or time of the Korean War, rather, that the sort of geographic rift in drastically different directions that those two countries went have had longer term ramifications. That North Korea, of course, widely considered more of a military style dictatorship. South Korea has generally opened up in terms of its markets and connections and international trade. And you can see that, right, in a photo taken at night that shows the differences in the amount of power of businesses, of lights and things going on at night in South Korea down there versus North Korea, right, where it's almost pitch black. So as a result, right, that's an example of the ways that economic systems offer significant differences in importance. As South Korea has much more open or free trade, right, you're likely to see it as a much more lively, physically bustling place. We also know, right, that a lot of the time markets and economic structures are gravitated towards self-interest, right? That markets, corporations, businesses oftentimes are motivated by maximizing profit, minimizing loss. We know that there's a lot of political and social disagreements surrounding the degree to which markets should be regulated or controlled, right? You might be familiar with the idea of the invisible hand, right, or the idea that markets would be self-correcting, that Free and open market is the way to go, but also disagreement, right? Perspectives that say no, there should be varying levels of governmental organization or control over markets. That's an important consideration too, is the way that our approach to markets impacts how our groups and international organizations are structured. We open or we close trade. So one of the last ideas that I want to hit on before I divide you up into another activity are the ideas of theory X, Y, and Z. And I think these are useful when we're thinking about intercultural and international communication because they inform the way that we think about or approach group membership and the motivations of different groups, right? And one of the key ways to differentiate these theories is to think about what do these theories assume about humans, about their goals, their behavior, and so on. So the first idea here is theory X, right? You can think about it as the theory that people are not excited about or don't really want to work or participate. If you're familiar, and folks who have had a class with me before, probably know I talked about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the idea that we oftentimes have these basic physiological needs at the bottom. Once those are fulfilled, right, we keep moving up towards self-actualization. Theory X is pretty compatible with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? It says, no, people, if they're working in a group and working together on an issue, are not going to be the ones that want to put in the work or that really want to contribute. You can think back to social loafing and the bystander effect as an example of this, right? Oftentimes people might not want to do the work if they can pass it on to somebody else. That's the theory X, right? People generally are not a fan of putting in work. Under theory X, right, people would consider some of those lower levels of Maslow's hierarchy of needs first. Things like their physiological needs, their safety, love and acceptance, and so on, right? And then lastly, they would pursue something like self-actualization, becoming the best version of themselves, doing the things that they want to and dream about. Under this theory, then, there might need to be a lot more hard-coded rules, regulations, and how group members behave. Under the assumption that in order for a group to work, its people have to have a motivation that ties to these lower level needs. You need to put in this work by the end of the week or you're fired. Would be an example of how theory X would incorporate safety needs in order to get members of the group to work, right? If you want to stay on scholarship, you've got to practice twice a week. Theory Y is the opposite, right? So theory Y says that inherently people are motivated to do a good job. People want to participate in a group, to contribute, to offer their thoughts, and so on, right? That people want to get their roots down and to participate. This suggests, right, a lot of emphasis on people being independent toward their goals, that they're ambitious, they want to contribute and participate within the group, that they're self-directed, that they're capable of managing and participating in the group on their own, and that they're capable, again, of this idea of self-actualization, being who they want to be, becoming the best version of themselves. Under theory Y, right, rather than punishing or using things like, get this in by the end of the week or you're fired, a supervisor might say, well, I know you want to do a good job, so I look forward to receiving this assignment back from you, right? So theory Y is a lot more optimistic about how people behave, right, and participate in groups. And then lastly, we have theory Z. And theory Z is a combination of the two, right? It's a middle ground, and I wanted to use an example, right, of like people who are sort of balancing or doing a trapeze act. Not only is there somebody that's balancing like theory X and theory Y, but there's also people who are helping each other up, who are holding each other, right, on this high wire act. And that's theory Z, right? It's the idea that people are somewhere in between, that they're interested, yes, in self-actualizing and fulfilling their needs, but they also need reinforcement. They need to feel belonging and participation within the group, right? For instance, Eastern Oregon University has recently announced that they're naming one of their organizations on campus, the Office of Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging, right? Dealing with the idea that belonging, participation, feeling like they're part of the group is crucial. That is, under theory Z, people do have some core safety needs, particularly able to contribute and to participate. So again, theory X assumes people don't want to work, they're self-interested. Theory Y says people do want to work, they're motivated to do a good job. Theory Z says people would like to do some good things, but they need these safeguards and reinforcement in order to get them. So what I want to do now is I will divide you up into 3 different groups. And I have another scenario for you that will help you as you're preparing for the assignment we'll be discussing next week. So in this scenario, right, you and your group members are in are creating a small business. You can choose, maybe it's a restaurant, maybe it's like an activity or an organization on campus, but you're creating a new small business. Using a theory, and I'm going to assign you into X, Y, or Z, explain how that theory impacts the way that you would hire and treat your coworkers. How you would organize your small business group to support diverse and international people, given some of the things we brought up. And then lastly, what would be necessary to create a good workplace culture? Again, asking us to apply and think about some of the things that we've been discussing so far. So we have. So let's do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Let's do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then we'll have everybody on Zoom as a group. This group over here will be on theory X. This group here will be on theory Y. And our Zoom group will be on theory Z. So take some time to think about and work through this prompt, and we'll discuss it together in just a little bit. I'll go for it, yeah.
How's it going, guys? So. Oh, yeah. Are you ready?
Yeah.
All right. What kind of small business are we starting? Rodeo shop? Okay. All right, rodeo.
For theory X, would you say that it's more like giving people like ultimatums to do stuff?
Yeah, I mean, one way of thinking about it is like, how do you appeal to those lower level authorities? So there's a couple ways to do it, right? Carrot or stick. Either you provide them with assurances or safety that helps them get to things like self-actualization, or you use things like those basic needs as a motivator, right?
Here's the deal. Lay it out for them.
I wrote like an opposition against like labor and stuff. I would make it seem as though it's easy to get them to do the job.
Make it a fun work environment.
Yeah.
And tell them that they won't get love or acceptance until they complete the job.
Well, just kind of like
But,
use it as like a tool to like pull you
but
to want to.
if you make
Yes,
it
what's up?
a fun
So
work
people are
environment,
hiring, it's like
you know.
theory Y or
Hey, we're
theory
having a
theory
good
Y.
time.
So how would theory Y explain the way it would
We
hire,
gotta get this job done. Let's have some fun while we're doing it.
right?
Yeah.
So how would you work
Give
with
them that
or
sense of
employ
belonging.
people, given the assumptions of that theory?
Yeah, I'm sure, I know you've done a
Okay.
shitty job that they didn't want to do, it's like, but like, it makes it 100 times better if you feel like you're surrounded by good people. Eventually, I'll catch you up, but I'll let you get that.
So we organize so that they have like an international set of workers, like people from different countries.
Yeah.
Come work at the froyo shop.
Yeah, so yeah, people come in from a lot of diverse cultures or backgrounds.
Okay. How we diversify.
Jesus. I mean, one thing you can do is like be open to every idea. Like I think if we have an open mind to everything, accept the different like cultures for what they are.
And there's different like labor perspectives, because I mean, I'm sure each culture has different labor perspectives. And just be very embracing of everything.
We embrace our culture, so someone comes from North Korea, we still don't manage.
Obviously, do something so radical.
We can do like small events.
Yeah.
Japanese sushi event or something.
Yeah.
Japanese like after that. Okay, this is really my company.
Okay, yeah.
And yes, celebrating like the tradition.
Yeah.
Like giving like days off for like, you know, how we all have all holidays. If they want, like, there's a holiday for them that they want to celebrate, giving them that off and respecting that.
Be necessary to create a good workplace culture. Some good people working there.
What do you define as good versus bad? What are we looking for?
Don't hate on other people's culture.
I get a
Yeah,
bonus.
exactly.
There's good versus bad people that you have worked in your workplace.
Cool. I feel like accepting people who really like want to be inclusive, provide love, and reflect like our businesses, goals and opportunities.
Yeah. Bingo.
So we'll give people a couple more minutes on this. Sounds like a lot of the groups are. wrapping up.
So accepting people who are considerate of others and provide the safety and sorry. Oh,
I think.
they have one shortstop. Yeah, shortstop for a
Stopped in school, but I haven't had it forever.
Thinking, wait, is the local beef rodeo?
No, locally just ice cream.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, we only do ice cream. and coffee.
Sinclair does have actual rodeo, and they have a bunch of different toppings.
You know what, I always used to stop at home, I'm like way over here from home, and they got a Froyo spot, your area in their Chevron there.
Yeah.
And I never wanted to like really sit down and eat Froyo, so. Yeah, but it's always.
What school did you guys support?
Staten, was in high school.
Were you at school with, Ryan?
He's a senior when I was a freshman or something like that.
All right, so let's chat a little bit about this. So I want to hear first from the Zoom folks. How did you all address this first question? How does that theory affect the way that you would treat or behave with coworkers?
I'm gonna let Justin take this one just because he wrote down kind of what we said.
Sure.
Okay, so what we said was that reinforcement and making the person feel like they belong in the group and feeling very welcoming is huge. And that rewards and praise can just have a huge impact on a new employee.
Yeah,
And we feel that the new people should feel welcomed and they should want to work there.
yeah. So creating that initial background, welcoming, inclusive, and so on. Again, it contributes to that overall feeling of belonging that really helps with participation. How about this group over here? How did you address the second question on organization to support diverse populations?
So we said that we reward our staff by making it. So we said bilingual or fluency in ALS can get rewarded with a bonus with a pass fluency test. Religious time off, school holidays time off with bonuses to come into work those days.
Yeah, right. One important way to think about like international organization is to think about the variation in holidays that might be celebrated depending on culture, spiritual or religious background, right? For instance, having something like Kwanzaa be recognized would be an important way to support workers from diverse backgrounds. And then this group over here, what did you all say in regards to creating a good workplace culture?
Having accepting people, providing love, respect for others, provide safety as well, creating a good workplace culture.
Yeah, so y'all were bringing up like the froyo shop and just kind of making that a fun, but also, a thoughtful way of bringing people together from different backgrounds and so on, right? So one of the things that I noticed as I was hearing you all share some of your different theories and approaches, right, is think about the goals and the assumptions that we have about people, right? So theory X does not necessarily mean that you have to punish or have basically the core values or crucial things like safety needs being kind of held for ransom, right? It could also mean under theory X that you address and get those core level issues dealt with. Maybe your business offers a really good health plan. Maybe it provides really core services under the assumption, right, that you can bring people up as a hierarchy to get to things like self-actualization. Under theory Y, right, as you all brought up, in terms of celebrating or offering things like bonuses or incentives, you're creating opportunities where people could work or could do a good job. And then lastly, through theory Z, the Zoom group brought up some of the ways that, creating inclusion, especially in the early stages, right, and creating that sense of belonging or a good workplace culture would be a really core element. So appreciate you all's contributions and thoughts for today. To wrap up, we talked a little bit about international systems and structures and the ways that they impact our communication groups. We talked a little bit about what international organization is and how it impacts the way we communicate. And then we talked about these three different theories as different approaches to understanding and making sense of the how and why of group communication. So next class, we'll come back next week. We'll be looking at some of the ways that we solve major problems. So our focus next week will be about problem solving for a lot of different complex and challenging issues. So we'll be focusing on those for next week. Have a great weekend, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.